The November wind had teeth. It bit across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory with a relentless, scouring force that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and rattled the very bones of the ranch house. It was a wind that tasted of dust and distant snow, a promise of the brutal winter to come. Inside the Circle E ranch house, Jack Calder felt the cold seep through the log walls, a chill that had little to do with the weather. It was a cold that had settled deep inside him a year ago and refused to leave. He stood before the stone hearth, the fire within it little more than a pile of sullen, glowing embers. The hearth was the heart of the home, his father had always said, but this one beat with a slow, fading pulse, like everything else on the Circle E. It felt depleted, running on fumes. The long drought of the summer had left the grass thin and brittle, and the fever that followed had taken a dozen of his best cattle. It had taken his fight, too. Now, there was just him, the silence, and the land that demanded more than one man could give. His gaze drifted to the small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Mary. Her smile was a ghost in the dim light. He had built this life for her, for them, and now he was just a caretaker of memories, failing at even that. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down until some days it was a chore just to draw breath. It was that crushing weight that had finally driven him to ride into Sagebrush Bend and tack a notice to the board outside the post office. He had written it on a piece of foolscap in his blunt, awkward script. Cook in hand needed. A man who could handle a skillet as well as a rifle, who understood the solitude of the plains. He had added a specific, hopeful line widowed man preferred. He figured another man who had known loss would not bring noise and pointless chatter into the quiet grief of the house. He needed a hand, not a friend. He needed competence, not conversation. 2 days later, that same wind escorted the afternoon train into the station at Sagebrush Bend, its whistle a mournful cry against the vast, empty sky. A handful of passengers disembarked onto the splintered platform, blinking against the harsh light. Among them was a woman who seemed to draw the shadows around her like a shawl. Ava Mayhew stepped down from the carriage with a quiet grace, her hand steady on the rail. She was perhaps 25 years of age, with a face that was more striking than beautiful, defined by a strength that seemed at odds with her slender frame. Her traveling dress was plain, dark, and meticulously clean, showing signs of wear but not of neglect. She carried no luggage save for a single, small wooden trunk, its corners bound in worn leather. She stood for a moment, clutching the handle of the trunk as if it were an anchor in a strange sea. Her eyes, a deep and guarded gray, scanned the dusty street of the town. Sagebrush Bend was not much. A raw collection of clapboard buildings huddled together against the immensity of the landscape. A small church with a leaning steeple, a saloon whose bat-wing doors swung with every gust, a post office, and a general store. But dominating the edge of town was the black, hulking shape of the Rail Dominion coal depot, a constant, grimy reminder of the power that was slowly strangling the territory. Ava clutched the letter in her pocket, a thin and vaguely worded recommendation from a parson in Kansas who had known her for all of 3 weeks. It was a flimsy shield, but it was all she had. Kansas! The name itself left a bitter taste in her mouth. The whispers and accusing glances followed her even here, 1,000 miles away. They called her a saloon girl from the Golden Finch, a place of cheap music and cheaper virtue. The rumor was a lie, a poisoned barb thrown by a man whose cruelty she had dared to challenge. She had only worked in the kitchen, her hands raw from scrubbing pots and peeling potatoes, saving a younger girl from the saloon owner's heavy fists. Her reward had been a dismissal, a sullied name, and the necessity of flight. All she wanted now was a place to be invisible, a place where the work was honest and her past could be buried under the vast, uncaring sky. She needed this job. As she stood contemplating her next move, a commotion up the street drew her attention. A wagon, laden with supplies and driven by a Native American man, hit a deep rut. The jolt sent a small child, a boy of about 4, tumbling from the back. He landed in the dusty street with a cry of pain and surprise. His mother, walking beside the wagon, screamed. People stopped and stared, a few murmuring, but no one moved. Before she was even aware of making a decision, Ava was in motion. She set down her trunk and moved with a swift, purposeful stride. She reached the boy, knelt beside him, and her hands were gentle but firm as they checked his arms and legs. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, her calm cutting through the boy's frightened sobs. He had a nasty scrape on his arm, bleeding freely into the dust. Without hesitation, Ava tore a clean strip from her own petticoat, using it to wipe the wound before binding it with a practiced efficiency. She helped the boy to his feet and returned him to his grateful mother, accepting the woman's hurried, thankful words with a simple, quiet nod. She then retrieved her trunk and stepped back onto the platform, her brief, compassionate intervention over as quickly as it had begun. She did not notice the man watching from across the street. Jack Calder had just finished loading a sack of flour and a box of cartridges into the back of his buckboard. He had seen the whole thing. He had seen the child fall, had seen the crowd's hesitation, and then had seen the woman move. There was no fuss, no hysterics, just a calm, immediate competence that was as rare as a summer rain. He noted her plain dress, her lack of baggage, and her quiet self-possession. He figured her for a mail-order bride or a schoolteacher, though she had the hands of someone used to hard work. He was about to turn his horse for home when he saw her pull a letter from her pocket, the same type of envelope he had received a few days prior. The handwriting on his own letter had been neat, precise, but with a certain lightness that could have been a man's or a woman's. He had assumed the writer, E. Mayhew, was a man, a quiet man, given the brevity of the correspondence. Watching her now, her stillness and the efficient way she had handled the child, he made a different sort of calculation. This must be him, the one he hired, a quiet fellow, just like he wanted, perhaps younger than he expected, and not a widower. But the competence he had just witnessed was worth more than any qualification he had written on the notice. He clicked his tongue, guiding the horse across the street and pulling the buckboard up beside the platform. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt foreign after so long. "You eat Mayhew?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse. Ava looked up, startled. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind. There were lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a deep-set sadness that he did not try to hide. He looked like the land itself, rugged and enduring and marked by hardship. "I am Eva Mayhew," she corrected softly. Jack nodded, missing the distinction entirely. "Jack Calder, Circle E, I got your letter. Figured I would save you the walk." Relief washed over Eva so intensely, her knees felt weak. This was it. This was her employer. He had come for her. She had not expected it. She certainly had not expected him to mistake her for a man. But in this moment, all that mattered was the job, the chance. She could sort out the details later. A quiet cook in hand. The notice had said she could be quiet. She could cook, and her hands were strong enough for any work he could give her. "Thank you, Mr. Calder," she said, her voice steady. He grunted in response, leaning down to take her trunk. He swung it into the back of the buckboard with an easy strength that spoke of a life of physical labor. He gestured for her to climb up onto the seat beside him. The ride out of town was silent. Jack was not a man for small talk, and Ava was grateful for it. It gave her time to observe, to file away the details of her new life. As they passed the Rail Dominion depot, she saw a man in a tailored suit step out onto the porch, watching them go. He stood with Deputy Jeb Crow, a man with a fleshy face and small, greedy eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Ava saw the deputy's gaze linger on Jack's buckboard, an unpleasant, calculating look that made her feel a prickle of unease. Jack saw the look too, and his hands tightened on the reins. He knew Silas Mercer. The man in the suit was the brain and the money behind the Rail Dominion's relentless push west. and he knew Deputy Crow was Mercer's dog, sniffing out weakness and opportunity. The bank in Sagebrush Bend, where his loan was held, had recently been acquired by a larger institution with ties to Mercer. Jack did not believe in coincidences. Rumors were flying among the ranchers about the railroad wanting to reroute their new line, to push it straight through the valley that held Dry Willow Creek. The creek was the only reliable water for miles, the lifeblood of the Circle E and a half-dozen other ranches. Without it, their land would be worthless. Jack's debt made him vulnerable, and he knew Mercer and Crow were just waiting for him to fail. The buckboard rattled on, leaving the town behind and entering the vast, rolling expanse of the plains. The land was beautiful in its starkness, a sea of pale grass under an endless sky. It was a landscape that could swallow a person whole, and Ava felt a sense of both fear and freedom. Here, a person's worth was measured not by whispers and rumors, but by what they could do, by their ability to endure. When they finally arrived at the Circle E, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant, bleeding strokes of orange and purple. The ranch house was a sturdy, simple structure of dark, weathered logs, built to withstand the elements. A large barn stood nearby, along with a series of corrals. It was a good spread, or had been once. Now, it had an air of neglect, of a place holding on by a thread. Jack led her inside. The main room was dominated by the great stone hearth, its fire now nothing but gray ash. The air was cold and still. The furniture was sparse and masculine, well made but showing its age. Everything was clean, but it was the sterile cleanliness of a place that is merely occupied, not lived in. There was no warmth, no life. It was the house of a man waiting for something to end. He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. "You can put your things in the small room off the back. Kitchen is yours. I eat at 6. With that, he turned and went back outside, leaving Ava alone in the echoing silence of the house. She walked into the kitchen and set her hand on the cast-iron stove. It was stone cold. A thick layer of dust covered every surface. The pantry was nearly bare. A bag of flour, some beans, coffee, salt. Nothing more. She looked out the small kitchen window. Jack was standing by the corral, his silhouette a dark, unmoving shape against the dying light. He was looking out over his land and his water and his memories. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that this man was fighting a war on his own, and standing in the cold, barren kitchen. She understood that her own quiet battle for survival had just become entangled in his. The wind howled around the corners of the house, a lonely, desolate sound. Ava took a deep breath, tied on her apron, and began to work. The first thing to do was build a fire. The first light of dawn was the color of a fresh bruise. It spread across the eastern horizon, offering no warmth, only a weak and watery illumination that made the frosted plains look vast and dead. Jack Calder was already in the barn, the heat of his breath pluming in the frigid air. He had not slept. The weight of the Circle E, of his memories, had pressed down on him through the night, a familiar and suffocating blanket. He moved with the stiff, weary motions of a man running on his last reserves, forking hay to the horses, his mind a dull churn of debt and drought. It was the sound of a horse, a single rider approaching at a steady, unhurried pace, that made him pause. He stepped out of the barn and saw the silhouette against the pale sky. He did not need to see the man's face to know who it was. Only one man in the territory rode with that particular brand of smug authority. Deputy Jeb Crow reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, the leather of his saddle creaking in the frozen silence. He did not dismount. He looked down at Jack from his elevated position, a faint, unpleasant smile playing on his lips. Crow said that he had some business with him. He pulled a folded document from the inside of his coat. He told Jack it was an official notice from the county bank, a foreclosure warning. He leaned down and handed the paper to Jack, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. Jack took the document. His hands were numb with cold, but he felt a different kind of chill as he unfolded the paper. The legal language was dense and suffocating, but the meaning was clear. His loan payments were declared delinquent. The bank was calling in the note, the entire property. The Circle E was to be seized in 30 days. His eyes scanned the page, searching for a mistake, a way out. He found nothing but the cold, hard finality of the words, and at the bottom, a stamp, a county seal. But it was blurry, the ink smudged as if applied in haste or with a clumsy hand. It looked wrong. Jack looked up at Crow. He asked him what this was. He knew it was a fool's question. He knew exactly what it was. It was a death sentence for his ranch. Crow's smile widened. He told Jack it was just the law taking its course. He said Jack was behind on his payments, and Mr. Mercer's bank was simply protecting its investment. He suggested Jack start packing his things. Jack's hands clenched around the paper, crinkling it. A hot, useless rage surged through him. He knew Silas Mercer's name was the poison in this well. He knew this piece of paper was a lie wrapped in the authority of the law, but he had no proof. He was one man against the railroad and its bought and paid for deputy. He told Crow to get off his land. The deputy simply chuckled, a low, grating sound. He reminded Jack that for the next 30 days, it was still his land. After that, it would belong to the bank. He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture, wheeled his horse around, and trotted away, leaving Jack standing alone in the biting cold, holding the weapon that had been forged to destroy him. Inside the house, a different world was taking shape. Ava had risen long before the sun, moving with a quiet efficiency that was the hallmark of her existence. She had found a purpose in the neglected kitchen. She had scrubbed the stove until the irons shone, swept the floors, and organized the sparse contents of the pantry. When Jack had left for the barn, she had found the small sack of coffee beans, the hand grinder, and had filled the cold, silent house with the rich, unfamiliar aroma of fresh coffee. She found the flour and lard and set about making biscuits, her hands moving with a sure and practiced rhythm. By the time the sun had risen, a fire blazed in the hearth, chasing the chill from the main room, and the kitchen was an island of warmth and order in a sea of masculine neglect. When Jack finally came inside, he looked like a man who had been struck a mortal blow. He moved like an old man, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A dry, racking cough shook his frame. He did not seem to notice the warmth or the clean surfaces or the smell of food. He walked past the kitchen without a glance and collapsed into a chair at the head of the heavy wooden table, the foreclosure notice lying beside his hand. He stared at the dead embers in the fireplace, his eyes hollow. Ava said nothing. She poured a thick black coffee into a tin mug and set it on the table in front of him. A moment later, she followed with a plate piled high with fluffy biscuits, swimming in a thick and savory gravy made with the last of the salted pork. She placed it beside the coffee and retreated to the kitchen. It was not her place to offer words. The food would have to speak for her. For a long time, he did not move. Then, as if coming out of a trance, he picked up the mug and drank, the hot liquid scalding his throat. He looked down at the plate. It was the first real meal he had seen in this house in over a year. He picked up his fork and began to eat. The food was simple, but it was honest and good. It was fuel. It was a small, solid anchor in a world that was dissolving around him. He ate every last bite, mopping the plate clean with the final biscuit. When he was done, he looked toward the kitchen. Eva was standing in the doorway, watching him, her expression unreadable. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only thanks he could muster. She nodded back and disappeared into the kitchen. That night, the wind returned with a vengeance, shrieking around the corners of the house like a restless spirit. Sleep was impossible. Jack, driven by a gnawing anxiety, pulled on his coat and went out to check on the cattle. They were restless, lowing nervously in the dark. He rode the fence line, his rifle resting across his saddle. his eyes straining to pierce the inky blackness. Everything seemed secure, yet the feeling of being watched, of a coiled threat waiting in the shadows, would not leave him. Inside, Ava was finishing her nightly cleanup. The kitchen was now her domain, a place of comforting routine. She took a set of butcher knives from a wooden block. They were dull from neglect. She found a whetstone in a drawer and began the slow, meditative work of sharpening them. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was a steady, reassuring sound against the howl of the wind. The knife in her hand was a simple tool, but it felt like more. It was a symbol of her craft, of her ability to provide, to survive. She would not be left defenseless. When the kitchen was in perfect order, she went to latch the back door. As she bent down, her eyes caught something on the floorboards, nearly invisible in the lantern light. A small, bent horseshoe nail. But it was not a nail from one of Jack's horses. It was smaller, from a boot heel, and it was caked with a thick, greasy black mud, flecked with tiny, iridescent chips of coal. She had seen mud exactly like it in town, in the runoff from the Rail Dominion depot. It was distinct. She picked up the nail, wrapped it in a small piece of cloth, and tucked it into her apron pocket. It was a small thing, but her instincts told her it was important. A short while later, she heard it, a frantic bellowing from the herd, followed by a sharp, angry shout from Jack. The sounds were carried on the wind, distorted and alarming. She went to the window, peering out into the darkness, but could see nothing. She could only wait. He returned an hour later, his face grim, his coat flecked with mud. The cough was back, worse than before. He told her what had happened, his voice low and ragged. He spoke more to the room than to her. Someone had cut the fence on the north pasture, the section bordering the deep, treacherous cut of Dead Man's Ravine. They had driven a dozen of his best heifers into the darkness. He had found the tracks. They were gone. He slumped into the chair, the exhaustion so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out. He knew it was no random act of rustlers. 12 cattle. It was a precise number, just enough to push the value of his remaining herd below the collateral threshold outlined in the bank's loan agreement. It was another move in their cold, calculated game. First the paper, then the knife. He looked utterly broken. He waved a hand dismissively, telling her not to bother with dinner. He had no appetite for it. Ava looked at the man, at the deep lines of grief and exhaustion etched into his face, and for the first time, she did not see an employer. She saw a man being systematically destroyed. A quiet, stubborn anger took root inside her. She would not let this place, this small chance at a peaceful life, be torn down around her. She turned and went back to the kitchen, her movements now filled with a fierce resolve. She stoked the fire in the stove and set a heavy pot onto heat. She worked quickly, chopping onions and carrots, searing the last of a small venison roast Jack had hanging in the smokehouse. She made a thick, rich stew, filling the house with the aroma of simmering meat and herbs. It was a meal meant to fortify, to push back against the cold and the despair. When it was ready, she ladled it into a bowl and carried it to the table. He was still sitting there, staring into space, his coughing fits coming closer together. She set the bowl in front of him. He shook his head, starting to say he did not want it. She did not argue. She simply pushed the bowl a little closer to him, placed a spoon beside it, and stood there, waiting. As she reached across the table, the loose cuff of her dress rode up her arm, revealing her wrist in the lamplight. For a fleeting second, a pale, discolored mark was visible against her skin, a faint, yellowish-purple shadow of an old and brutal bruise. A memory flashed behind her eyes, sharp and unwelcome. The sound of a tinny piano, the sour smell of spilled beer, a man's voice, thick with liquor and rage. She flinched, a small, involuntary tightening of her muscles, and quickly pulled her sleeve back down. The past was never as buried as she hoped. Jack, lost in his own troubles, did not see the mark or her reaction, but he saw her quiet insistence. Something in her unwavering stance broke through his apathy. He picked up the spoon. He took a bite of the stew. The warmth spread through his chest, soothing the raw ache of his lungs. He took another, and then another. He ate the entire bowl. When he was finished, a different kind of silence settled between them. It was not the silence of strangers, but of two people sharing a space in the midst of a storm. He finally looked at her, his gaze clear for the first time. He saw the strength in her quiet demeanor, the unyielding competence. He finally said what had been unsaid between them since she had arrived. He told her he had advertised for a man. Ava did not look away. Her gray eyes met his without fear or apology. She did not defend herself. She simply stood her ground, acknowledging his statement with her stillness. He looked around the room, at the warm fire, the clean floor, the comforting order she had brought out of his chaos. He thought of her calm hands tending to the injured child in town. He thought of the food that had just brought him back from the edge. A man could not have done more. A man might have done less. He let out a long breath. He told her the work was hard. He told her the trouble was just beginning. He said the job was hers, if she still wanted it. Ava's expression did not change, but a small measure of the tension left her shoulders. She told him she was not afraid of hard work. With those few words, a fragile pact was sealed. The lines had been drawn. Outside, the railroad and its men were preparing to tear his world apart. But inside the ranch house, in the small circle of warm lantern light, Jack Calder was no longer entirely alone. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of tense watchfulness. Jack rose before the sun, his face a mask of grim determination, and rode the perimeter of his property, checking for new signs of intrusion. Ava worked from dawn until dusk, transforming the cold, neglected ranch house into a place of warmth and order. The air now smelled of baking bread and strong coffee instead of dust and sorrow. They moved around each other with a careful, quiet courtesy, the vast, unspoken landscape of their troubles stretching between them. Their conversations were brief, limited to the necessities of running the ranch. What needed to be done, what was running low, what the weather promised. One morning, over a breakfast of fried eggs and bacon, Jack announced he was riding into Sagebrush Bend. He told her he was going to the county clerk's office to look for the original copy of his loan agreement. He needed to see if the seal on his document matched the one on file. It was a long shot. He admitted. The clerk was a man who knew which side his bread was buttered on, and the Rail Dominion owned the bakery. Still, he had to try. He told Ava to keep the rifle by the door and to shoot at anything that did not belong. He would be back by nightfall. After he had gone, a profound quiet descended upon the Circle E. For the first time, Ava was truly alone on the ranch, the steward of this small, embattled piece of the world. She finished her morning chores, her movements efficient and automatic. Then, driven by a need to know the full measure of her new home, she began a thorough cleaning of the main room. She swept away the last vestiges of its long neglect, polished the wood of the table until it gleamed, and washed the windows until the stark beauty of the plains seemed to press right up against the glass. In a dusty corner, tucked behind a stack of old livestock ledgers, she found a small, locked chest. The key was in a tin box on the mantelpiece, alongside Jack's late wife's photograph. A pang of guilt struck her as she turned the key. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of his private grief. But the desire to understand the man she worked for, to understand the history of this place, was stronger. Inside, she did not find personal keepsakes. Instead, there were tools for gunsmithing, spare parts, and wrapped in an oilcloth at the very bottom, a small, elegant Derringer pistol. It was a woman's gun, pearl-handled and lightweight, but it was no toy. It was clean and well-oiled. She held it in her palm, the cold weight of it a surprising comfort. It was a tool of last resort, a final, emphatic way of saying no. She spent the better part of the afternoon in the empty corral behind the barn. She found a small box of cartridges in the chest and, with trembling hands, she taught herself the mechanics of the little pistol. The first shot was jarring, the sharp crack of it shockingly loud in the silence. It kicked in her hand, the smell of gunpowder stinging her nose, but she did not drop it. She fired again, and then again, aiming at an old fence post until her shots began to group together. She was not a natural, but she was determined. She would not be a victim. Not again. Later, as she was sorting through a pile of old mail and circulars Jack had left on a side table, she found it. It was a clipping from a newspaper, folded into a small square. It was not the notice Jack had posted, the one she had answered. This one was different, printed in finer type. It advertised for a hostess, a woman of agreeable temperament and discretion, to assist a prominent rancher in entertaining important investors from back east. The wording was careful, full of veiled suggestions about the nature of the entertainment required. The notice had been tucked into an envelope from the Sagebrush Bend post office. Eva's blood ran cold. She understood immediately. This was the trap. Crow, or one of his men, must have put this in the mail, hoping to lure a different kind of woman to the Circle E, a woman they could use to further shame and discredit Jack. But she, Eva, had answered the other notice. Jack had hired a cook. He had said so himself. Still, a seed of doubt, poisoned by her experiences in Kansas, took root in her mind. What if this was the real job? What if cook in hand was just a cover? What if Jack, in his desperation, was planning to use her in some way she could not bear to imagine? The world she knew was one where men in power rarely saw women as anything more than a commodity. She felt a wave of sickness and fear, but she looked out the window at the vast, lonely landscape and knew she had nowhere else to go. She would do her job, she would cook, and she would wait. The sun was a fiery smear on the horizon when Jack returned. He was not alone. Slumped over the saddle of a second horse was a young man, his face pale with pain. Jack's own expression was tight with a new kind of worry. He called for Eva as he rode up to the house. The injured man's name was Liam O'Connell. He was a railroad worker, young and Irish, with a mop of red hair and a face full of freckles. He had fallen from a trestle during the night shift, and his leg was broken, the bone jutting at an unnatural angle. Jack had found him crawling along the creek bed, trying to get away from the railroad camp. Liam had been terrified, babbling about Silas Mercer and the company doctor. He said the doctor would just let him die to avoid any official reports of an accident on the job. Eva's calm competence took over. She directed Jack to carry Liam inside and lay him on the narrow bed in her own small room. She sent Jack to fetch clean water and splintered wood for a splint. She tore strips from a clean bedsheet for bandages. Liam was delirious with pain, but Eva's low, steady voice and gentle hands seemed to soothe him. She worked with a focus that left no room for her own fears. She cleaned the wound, forced the bone back into place with a sickening crunch that made Jack wince, and then expertly bound the leg between the two splints. When she was done, Liam had fainted from the pain, but his breathing was even. She brewed a strong, bitter tea from willow bark, a trick she had learned from an old woman in Kansas, and told Jack to make sure Liam drank it when he woke. It would help with the fever and the pain. As she was cleaning up, Jack watched her, a look of grudging admiration in his eyes. He told her she had a surgeon's touch. He also told her his trip to town had been a waste of time. The county clerk had claimed the original loan documents were in transit to the main bank in Cheyenne and could not be viewed. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Then he told her the rest. Liam, in his feverish state, had talked. He worked on the night crew, the one laying track out near Dry Willow Creek. He spoke of secret shipments, of lumber and supplies that were recorded in one ledger but never appeared on the official manifests. He talked about a special crate of ink and a printing press that had been delivered to Mercer's office late one night. He was a witness, a dangerous witness, which was why he had been so desperate to get away after his accident. Now, he was here, under their roof. The danger had moved from the fence line right into their home. A new and terrible understanding dawned on Eva. The investors, the newspaper clipping, it was all real. Jack must be planning some desperate gamble, a dinner to try and win over these powerful men, and Liam's presence only made the situation more volatile. Her heart sank. She felt a cold, resigned dread. She had thought this place was different. She had thought he was different. But perhaps all men were the same when pushed into a corner. She said nothing. She went to the kitchen and began to prepare dinner, her mind a turmoil of confusion and fear. She would play her part. She had to. She made a thick beef stew, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. But as she worked, she felt as if she were preparing for her own execution. When the meal was ready, she looked at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. Her face was smudged with flour, her hair coming loose from its bun. She looked like what she was, a cook, not a hostess. With trembling hands, she washed her face and hands, smoothed her hair as best she could, and straightened the collar of her simple dress. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening into a brittle shell. She placed 2 bowls of stew, a loaf of fresh bread, and 2 clean white napkins on a wooden tray. She carried it out of the kitchen. Jack was sitting at the table, staring at the foreclosure notice which he had spread out before him. The weight of the world seemed to be on his shoulders. He looked up as she approached, his eyes tired and distant. Eva stopped at the edge of the kitchen doorway, her knuckles white where she gripped the tray. She could not bring herself to step fully into the room. She stood there, a prisoner of her own terrible misunderstanding. She looked at him, her gaze direct, her voice low but perfectly clear in the silent room. "Should I undress before dinner?" The question hung in the air. Monstrous and absurd. Jack stared at her, his face a canvas of pure, uncomprehending shock. The blood drained from his face, then returned in a dark, angry rush. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Then, a strange, terrible sound erupted from his chest. It was a laugh, but it held no humor. It was a raw, broken sound, full of pain and bitterness and a despair so profound it was almost a sob. It was the laugh of a man who had just been shown the final, cruel joke at the heart of his own tragedy. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. When he finally looked up, the laughter was gone, replaced by an expression of raw anguish. His voice was hoarse. "Eva, what in God's name are you talking about?" She just stared at him, her own face pale and frozen. She could not speak. He pushed himself away from the table, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He walked over to her, his movements stiff. He did not touch her. He just looked down at her. And for the first time, he seemed to see past the quiet cook, past the competent hand, and saw the frightened woman standing before him. "I hired a cook," he said, his voice softer now, but laced with a fierce, protective anger that was not directed at her. "I hired a person to cook my meals and help with the work. That is all. I would never— That is not— Who put such a thing in your head?" The brittle shell around Eva shattered. The tray trembled in her hands. The shame and fear she had been holding back washed over her, and she could not stop the tears that welled in her eyes. She told him about the newspaper clipping, her words tumbling out in a broken whisper. She told him she had found it in the mail, how she thought it was his real intention, that her real job was something else entirely. Jack listened, his expression hardening into a cold fury as he understood the cruel genius of the trap that had been set, a trap she had walked into in his place. He cursed Silas Mercer and Jeb Crow with a quiet, venomous intensity. Then he looked back at Eva, and his eyes were full of a deep, aching sadness. He understood what her assumptions said about the life she must have known, about a world where such a question could even be considered a possibility. He gently took the tray from her trembling hands and set it on the table. He pulled out a chair for her. Then he took one of the clean, white napkins from the tray and handed it to her. "Here, he said softly. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was an apology. It was an offering of respect. It was a recognition of her dignity. Eva took the napkin, its clean white linen a stark contrast to the grubby fears that had filled her mind. She wiped her eyes. They sat there in silence for a long moment, the uneaten stew growing cold between them. For the first time, the space between them was not filled with unspoken troubles, but with a fragile, shared humanity. A bond had been forged in the crucible of a terrible misunderstanding, a quiet promise that in this house, at least, she would be safe. A fragile truce settled over the circle in the wake of Eva's shattering question. The air, once thick with unspoken grief and suspicion, was now clear, though painfully thin. They spoke little, but a new understanding flowed beneath the surface of their quiet routines. Jack no longer saw just a competent hand. He saw a woman who had been wounded by the world in ways he was only beginning to grasp. And Ava, in the raw honesty of his disbelief and the simple offering of a clean napkin, had been granted a measure of the dignity she had fought so long to reclaim. The house felt warmer, not just from the fire she kept blazing in the hearth, but from the tentative spark of this shared humanity. 2 days later, the sky turned the color of lead. The wind, which had been a constant, biting companion, fell away into an unnerving stillness. A deep and penetrating cold settled over the plains, and then the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a picturesque winter, but small, hard pellets, driven by a newly risen wind that tore at the house with a low, menacing growl. The world beyond the windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white. Jack came in from the barn, stamping the snow from his boots, his eyebrows and the brim of his hat caked in white. He announced that the storm was settling in for a long stay. He would have to move the half-dozen pregnant heifers, the ones due to calve late, into the relative safety of the barn. It would be a long night. The scent of the storm brought the coyotes down from the hills, their hunting calls thin and sharp on the wind. The three of them spent the afternoon in the cavernous, lamp-lit warmth of the barn. The air was thick with the sweet smell of hay and the earthy scent of the animals. Jack and Eva worked together, their movements efficient and synchronized, preparing fresh bedding and securing the heavy doors against the blizzard's assault. Liam O'Connell, his splinted leg propped on a pile of hay sacks, watched them from a makeshift bed in an empty stall. The willow bark tea had eased his pain, and the simple, decent food Eva brought him had begun to restore his strength. He was still a prisoner of his injury, but for the first time since his fall, he felt safe. As the storm raged outside, its fury a constant, muffled roar, the enforced stillness inside the barn seemed to loosen Liam's tongue. He began to talk, his voice low at first, then gaining strength as the memories and fears poured out of him. He told them it was not just a few missing supplies he had witnessed. It was a whole phantom operation. Every night, a special train with 2 or 3 cars would arrive at the Dry Willow siding, long after the last passenger train had gone through. There were no official records of its coming or going. The crew was always the same, a tight-lipped group of men loyal only to Silas Mercer. Liam explained how they would unload new railroad ties, far more than were needed for the official track they were laying. These ties were marked with a specific carpenter's symbol, a small, carved bird in flight, which was the private mark of a crew Mercer had brought in from out of state. These ghost supplies, Liam said, were recorded in a separate ledger, a book Mercer kept in his own office. The official books, the ones the railroad inspectors saw, showed the company barely breaking even, an excuse to justify cutting wages and rushing the work. But the real profits were hidden in the ghost ledger, profits from selling those stolen supplies to other, less scrupulous operations. He shifted in the hay, his eyes wide in the lantern light. He said the worst of it was the press. He had helped unload the crate himself, thinking it was just spare parts for an engine. It was heavy, and when a corner of the crate splintered, he had seen what was inside. It was a small printing press, the kind used for official documents, and with it came a special, heavy paper and a particular brand of black ink. A week later, ranchers up and down the line started receiving foreclosure notices. He had seen one, the smudged seal, the feel of the paper, the specific shade of the ink. It was all the same. He was certain of it. The notices were being printed right there in Sagebrush Bend, forgeries created to steal the land the railroad coveted. A heavy silence fell in the barn, broken only by the wind and the soft munching of the cattle. Jack and Ava exchanged a look. It was all there. The motive, the means, the proof. But it was locked away in Mercer's office, guarded by men like Jeb Crow. Liam's testimony was their only weapon, and he was a wounded, terrified man. Before dawn the next morning, the storm broke, the wind died, and a profound, crystalline silence descended. The world was blanketed in a thick layer of pristine white snow. As the first pale light of morning touched the horizon, Jack was already saddling 2 horses. He told Eva he was going to the Dry Willow Bridge. The ghost trains Liam had described had to have crossed it. There might be some sign, some piece of evidence left behind. Eva met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. She told him she was going with him. He started to object, to say it was too dangerous, but she cut him off. Her voice was quiet but unyielding. She told him she was a better tracker in the snow than he was, and her eyes were sharper. Besides, she added, he could not stop her from going, and it was better if they went together. Something in her tone, a calm and absolute certainty, silenced his arguments. He simply nodded and handed her the reins of the second horse. She went into the house and returned a moment later with a small satchel. Inside, along with a block of cheese and some biscuits, was a pencil and a small, leather-bound sketchbook. They rode out into a world remade. The snow absorbed all sound, and the only noise was the muffled crunch of their horses' hooves. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. They followed the path of Dry Willow Creek, its water now a dark, sluggish ribbon between banks of white. The railroad bridge loomed ahead of them, a stark, black skeleton of wood and iron against the snow. They dismounted and tied their horses, proceeding on foot. The snow beneath the bridge was largely undisturbed. Jack moved slowly, his eyes scanning the massive wooden support beams, and then he saw it, carved into the wood of a new-looking tie, almost hidden in the shadows, was the faint but unmistakable shape of a small bird in flight. Liam had been telling the truth. Eva's contribution was even more significant. As Jack examined the beams, she scoured the ground, half hidden in the snow near the base of a piling. She found a small, discarded piece of lead. It was a seal, the kind used to secure valuable cargo crates. It had been stamped with an insignia, a simple design of a hammer crossed over a spike, the emblem of the Rail Dominion. But what was crucial was the imperfection. A tiny hairline crack ran through the face of the stamp, a flaw that would be replicated on every seal it pressed. Ava took out her sketchbook. Her hands were numb with cold, but her fingers were steady as she drew. She made a perfect, detailed sketch of the carpenter's mark. Then, using the side of her pencil lead, she made a rubbing of the lead seal, capturing the emblem and its telltale flaw with precise accuracy. They had it. It was not the ghost ledger itself, but it was physical proof that tied the railroad's secret shipments to this exact location. It was a start. It was more than they had had yesterday. Their small victory was short-lived. As they were leading their horses back toward the open plains, a rifle shot cracked through the silent morning. The bullet whined past Jack's head, so close he felt the heat of its passage, and slammed into a cottonwood tree behind them. They were not alone. 3 riders emerged from a thicket of trees on the far side of the creek. Jeb Crow was in the lead, a rifle in his hands, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer. His 2 men fanned out, their own guns drawn, cutting off any chance of a direct retreat. Jack reacted instantly, pulling Eva and the horses behind a thick outcropping of rock. Another shot splintered the stone near his shoulder. They were pinned down, outgunned, Jack drew his own rifle, but it was a desperate situation. 3 guns to his 1. Ava's mind raced. Panic was a cold, useless thing. She needed to think. Her eyes darted around their small, rocky shelter, searching for an advantage. For anything. Her gaze fell on the satchel she had dropped in the snow. Inside was their food, her sketchbook, and something else. A small, tightly sealed canvas bag. It held 2 pounds of fine, white baking flour. An idea, born of desperation and the memory of her own kitchen, exploded in her mind. It was a wild, improbable chance. But it was the only one they had. She grabbed the satchel. The wind was picking up again, gusting from behind them, blowing toward the creek and their attackers. She looked at Jack, her eyes wide with urgency. She told him to get ready to run, to make for the narrow fissure in the rocks to their left. He looked at her, confused, but he saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes and nodded, trusting her. With all her strength, she threw the satchel. It sailed in a high arc, landing in the snow about 20 feet in front of them, directly in the path of the wind. As Crow and his men raised their rifles, distracted by the sudden movement, Jack fired. He did not aim to hit them, but to provide a distraction. His shot kicked up a spray of snow just to their right. At the same instant, Ava, who had picked up a jagged piece of rock, threw it with a desperate, flat trajectory. The rock struck the canvas bag. It split open. A great white cloud of flour erupted into the air, caught immediately by the gusting wind. It surged forward, a blinding, choking blizzard of white powder, directly into the faces of Crow and his men. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. The men cried out in shock and pain, their horses rearing in terror. They were completely blinded, sputtering and coughing as the fine powder filled their eyes, noses, and throats. For a precious few seconds, their attack dissolved into chaos. That was all the time Jack and Ava needed. They scrambled for the narrow crevice in the rock wall, pulling their spooked horses behind them. They squeezed through the opening just as the first blind. Angry shots from Crow's men began to ring out, the bullets ricocheting wildly off the rocks. They found themselves in a narrow, winding canyon, hidden from view. They ran, stumbling over the uneven, snow-covered ground, until the sounds of shouting and gunfire faded behind them. They were safe, for the moment. Jack leaned against the cold canyon wall, gasping for breath, a grim smile on his face. He looked at Ava with a newfound awe. It was only then that she saw it. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the sleeve of his thick wool coat, high on his left shoulder. He followed her gaze, his own expression one of surprise. He had not even felt it. In the chaos of the escape, a stray bullet had found its mark. The wound was not deep, a long, tearing graze, but it was bleeding freely, staining the pure white snow at his feet with crimson. The truth of their situation settled upon them with a cold, brutal finality. They had their evidence, but they were wounded, miles from home, and the enemy now knew exactly what they were looking for. The air in the ranch house grew thick with a tension that was sharper than the winter cold. Ava finished stitching the gash on Jack's shoulder, her fingers deft and steady, her face a mask of concentration. The bullet had torn through flesh and muscle, a painful, burning reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Jack sat stiffly, his jaw clenched against the pain, his gaze fixed on the smudged foreclosure notice that lay on the table like a death warrant. Their small victory at the bridge had come at a high price. They had evidence, yes, but they had also revealed their hand. Liam O'Connell, recovering in the small back room, was their most valuable and most vulnerable asset. His testimony could bring down Mercer's entire scheme. But he was a broken man, terrified of the railroad's reach. They were no longer just fighting for a piece of land. They were fighting for a man's life and the truth he carried. The final blow came 3 days later. A notice was nailed to the door of the Sagebrush Bend post office, stark and official against the weathered wood. Silas Mercer, in a move of audacious arrogance, had scheduled a public auction. In 10 days, All properties with delinquent loans held by his bank would be sold on the courthouse steps. The Circle E was first on the list. The announcement had its intended effect. A chill of fear fell over the neighboring ranchers. Men who had spoken of banding together now fell silent, avoiding Jack's gaze when he rode into town for supplies. Mercer's power was absolute. His message clear: defy me, and you will be next. That night, the decision was made. There was no grand discussion, just a quiet exchange over a supper of beans and cornbread. Jack announced that he was riding for Cheyenne at first light. Judge Callahan, the circuit judge, was an old friend of his father's, a man known for his rigid, uncompromising integrity. If any man in the territory could stand against the railroad's influence, it was Callahan. The foreclosure notice, Eva's sketches, and Liam's story, that was all the ammunition he had. He had to believe it was enough. Eva did not argue. She simply stated that she was going with him. He began to protest, that it was his fight, that she and Liam would be safer here. But she met his gaze with a look of such unwavering resolve that his words died in his throat. She told him that it was her fight, too. They had touched her life with their filth, and she would see it through. She reminded him that 2 riders moving fast were harder to track than 1, and that he would need someone to watch his back. He could not deny the truth in her words. They left 2 hours before dawn, under a sky littered with cold, distant stars. They wrapped Liam's written testimony, a painful, scrawled account of everything he had seen, in an oilcloth and packed it with Eva's sketchbook and the foreclosure notice. They left the man himself with a rifle, a full pantry, and a promise to return. They rode light and fast, pushing their horses eastward, with a small remuda of their best cattle driven before them. Their stated purpose, should anyone ask, was to move the herd to a sheltered winter pasture in the eastern hills. Their real purpose was a desperate, headlong race against time. For a full day, they rode through the vast, empty landscape, the silence broken only by the wind and the plodding rhythm of the hooves. The weight of what they were doing settled upon them. They were 2 people against a machine of greed and power that was devouring the West. The attack came on the afternoon of the second day. It began not with the crack of a rifle, but with a smell, a faint, acrid scent of smoke on the wind. Jack reined in his horse, his head up, sniffing the air like a wary animal. Then they saw it, a low, orange line on the western horizon, growing brighter, wider, a hungry mouth preparing to devour the dry prairie grass. It was a prairie fire, and it was moving toward them with terrifying speed. Driven by a strong westerly wind, it was no accident of nature. It was an ambush. Panic erupted among the cattle. They bellowed and turned, their eyes wide with terror, ready to stampede in any direction. Jack's face was a mask of cold fury. This was Crow's work. A fire was the perfect weapon. It was indiscriminate, destructive, and it left no evidence. He meant to scatter their herd, to separate them, to pick them off one by one in the ensuing chaos. There was no time for deliberation. Jack shouted at Eva over the growing roar of the flames. He pointed to a narrow gap in the bluffs to the north, a windbreak that could funnel the herd to safety. He told her to take the cattle, to keep them moving, to not stop for anything. He would deal with Crow. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, not for the fire, but for him. He met her gaze, and in that instant, a world of trust passed between them. She was no longer just the cook. She was his partner in this desperate fight. She gave a sharp nod, wheeled her horse around, and with a series of sharp, piercing cries, began to drive the terrified cattle toward the gap. She rode into the smoke and the chaos with a courage that stunned him. She became a whirlwind of motion, her horse responding to her every command, turning the led animals, forcing the herd into a tight, controlled run. She was a natural, a woman born to the saddle and the unforgiving landscape. As Eva disappeared into the haze, Jack turned his own horse south, toward a solitary, skeletal landmark that stood stark against the orange sky. A derelict windmill, its blades long since broken, its wooden tower a lonely sentinel on the plains. He knew that was where he would find him. Crow was a man who enjoyed a high vantage point from which to watch his destruction unfold. He found the deputy and his 2 men near the base of the tower, their figures wavering in the heat haze from the approaching fire. They were watching Ava's progress, a look of smug satisfaction on Crow's face. He had not expected Jack to turn and face them. Surprise, then anger, flashed in his eyes as Jack rode steadily toward them, his rifle held loosely across his saddle. Crow told him he was a fool, that he should have kept running. Jack dismounted, his movements deliberate and calm. He told Crow that his running days were over. The air crackled with a tension that was hotter than the fire. Crow gestured with his rifle, telling his men to take care of him. But Jack was already in motion. His first shot was not aimed at a man, but at the dry, rotting wood of the windmill's ladder. The bullet splintered the rung just as one of the hired guns placed his foot on it, sending the man tumbling to the ground with a cry of pain. The second man raised his rifle, but Jack was faster, his next shot kicking the weapon from the man's hands. Now it was just him and Crow. The deputy, his face a mask of rage and disbelief, fired a wild shot that went wide. Jack did not fire back. He walked forward, his own rifle held steady. He was not a killer. He was a man fighting for his home, his life, his honor. But he would end this. Crow, seeing the cold, implacable resolve in Jack's eyes, began to back away, his bravado crumbling into fear. He raised his rifle again, his hands trembling. Jack fired. The shot was precise, aimed not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet struck Crow's right hand, shattering the bones. The rifle clattered to the ground. Crow screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and shock, clutching his ruined hand. As he staggered back, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm fell open, spilling its contents onto the dusty ground. One paper, heavier than the rest, landed face up. It was a tally sheet, a list of properties, with figures scrawled next to them, and at the bottom, a signature, bold and arrogant, Silas Mercer. At that moment, as if in response to some unseen command, the wind shifted. It turned, blowing back from the east, pushing the fire back upon itself, robbing it of its fuel. The roaring inferno slowed, sputtered, and began to die, its fury spent. Jack stood over the whimpering deputy, the damning piece of paper at his feet. He was exhausted, his body screaming with the effort of the last few days, his wounded shoulder a hot, throbbing ache. He had won. He had the proof. He found Ava by the creek that ran through the wind gap. She had saved the herd. She was sitting on the ground, her face and clothes black with soot, her body trembling with reaction. She looked up as he approached, her eyes searching his for any sign of injury. He collapsed to the ground beside her, the strength finally leaving his legs. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the dying fire and the gentle murmur of the creek. The world around them was a blackened, smoking ruin, but they were alive. They had survived, and in the shared crucible of that survival, the last of their defenses crumbled away. His voice was a raw whisper when he finally spoke. He told her about Mary. He told her how his wife had taken ill with a fever while he was away on a 3-day cattle drive. He had returned to find her fading, and had ridden for the doctor, a full day's journey away. A sudden blizzard had trapped him on the trail. By the time he had made it back with the doctor, it had been too late. His guilt was not that he had left, but that he had not been there when she had needed him most. He had failed in his duty to protect her. Ava listened, her heart aching for the pain he had carried alone for so long. When he was finished, the silence returned, heavier now with the weight of his confession. Then she began to speak, her own voice quiet and steady. She told him the truth of what had happened in Kansas. She spoke of the golden finch, of a young girl, barely 16, who had been trapped there. She told him about the owner, a man whose cruelty was a quiet poison. She described the night she had found him with the girl, his intentions clear and ugly. Ava had intervened, using a heavy skillet to give the girl time to escape. She had not hurt him badly, but she had wounded his pride. In revenge, he had created the story that she was a woman of loose morals, a lie that was easier for the town to believe than the sordid truth. Her shame was not for her actions, but for the stain the world had placed upon them. When she finished, they looked at each other, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the smoke. They were two survivors, their souls laid bare in the ashes of the prairie. Jack reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his. He told her that what she had done was not shameful. It was brave, and she looked back at him, her eyes clear and full of a deep, sorrowful understanding, and told him that he had not failed his wife. He had been trying to save her. It was the storm, not him, that had taken her. They looked down at their joined hands, both of them black with soot. The filth of the fire, the ashes of the past, had touched them both. But it had not consumed them. In the heart of the destruction, they had found not an end, but a beginning. They rode back into Sagebrush Bend not as victors, but as survivors returning from a war. They were covered in soot and grime, their faces etched with exhaustion. But in their eyes was a new and unyielding light. The evidence, wrapped securely in the oilcloth, felt as heavy and as precious as a bar of gold. They had less than a week before the auction. Their return sent a ripple of nervous whispers through the town. People saw the bandage on Jack's shoulder, the blackened state of their clothes, and drew their own conclusions. Fear, already a constant companion in Sagebrush Bend, tightened its grip. The ranchers who had once clapped Jack on the back now crossed the street to avoid him. To stand with Jack Calder was to stand in the path of the fire. Ava knew their collection of evidence was not enough. They had Liam's testimony and her sketches, but it was the word of a wounded railroad worker and a nameless cook against the formidable power of Silas Mercer. They needed more. They needed to anchor their truth in the community itself. Her first visit was to the small mission church at the edge of town. It was run by Thomas Red Elk, a Native American pastor who had seen his own people's land vanish under the relentless tide of broken treaties and false promises. He was a man of quiet dignity, his face a roadmap of his people's long, sorrowful history. Eva found him tending a small garden behind the church, his hands in the very earth that Mercer sought to control. She did not show him the foreclosure notices or speak of legal matters. Instead, she unwrapped her sketchbook and showed him her rubbing of the flawed lead seal. She spoke to him of the ghost trains in the night, of the strange new lumber scarring the land by the sacred creek. She described the seal not as evidence, but as a poison, a mark of a deep sickness that was infecting the land and its people. Thomas Red Elk studied the drawing for a long time, his dark eyes filled with a weary wisdom. He had seen marks like this before, the emblems of powerful men from the East who came with promises and left with everything. He recognized the flaw in the seal not as a legal technicality, but as a spiritual one. It was the mark of a lie, an imperfection in the soul of the men who used it. He told Ava that he could not speak to the laws of white men, but he could speak to the truth of a righteous heart and the corruption of a greedy one. He agreed to bear witness. Eva's second visit was to the post office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of ink and old paper. Ruthie, the postmistress, was a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of spectacles. She was a woman who saw everything and said little. Eva placed the smudged foreclosure notice on the counter. She did not need to explain the situation. Ruthie had seen a dozen such notices pass through her hands in the last month, all destined for ranchers who were a thorn in the railroad's side. Eva simply pointed to the ink. She asked Ruthie if she recognized its particular flat, black sheen, the way it feathered slightly on the cheap paper. Ruthie pursed her lips. She disappeared into the back room and returned a moment later with a stack of official Rail Dominion envelopes. the kind used for their wage packets and supply orders. The ink was a perfect match, more than that. The official postmark stamp she used on Mercer's outgoing mail had recently developed a small nick in the corner, a flaw she had been meaning to report. The smudged seals on the foreclosure notices bore no such postmark. They had never passed through her office. They had been delivered by hand, under the cover of darkness. Ruthie slid 2 of the official railroad envelopes across the counter to Eva. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion, but in the face of Mercer's power, it was an act of profound courage. They did not have to wait for Cheyenne. Word of the confrontation at the windmill, of Crow's injury, had traveled fast. Judge Callahan, a man who did not wait for trouble to find him, brought his court to the trouble. He arrived in Sagebrush Bend with 2 federal marshals, his face as grim and unyielding as the granite hills. He declared that, in light of the impending auction and the serious accusations, he would convene an immediate circuit hearing. The town hall was cleared, its dusty tables and chairs rearranged to form a makeshift courtroom. The day of the hearing, the hall was packed. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and fear. On one side sat Silas Mercer, flanked by a slick, expensive lawyer from Cheyenne. He looked calm, untouchable. On the other side sat Jack and Eva. The townspeople, the ranchers and merchants and their families, filled the benches in between, a silent, anxious sea of faces. Judge Callahan began the proceedings with a voice that could cut stone. Jack, his arm in a sling, presented their case. He spoke plainly, without emotion, laying out the facts of the forged notice, the stolen cattle, the fire. He submitted Eva's sketches of the carpenter's mark and the flawed seal. The judge examined them closely. Then, Liam O'Connell's written testimony was read aloud by the clerk. A low murmur went through the crowd as the story of the ghost trains, the secret ledgers, and the printing press filled the room. For the first time, the townspeople heard the full scope of Mercer's scheme. It was not just about Jack Calder. It was about all of them. Judge Callahan then called for any other testimony. A long, heavy silence fell. Then, from the back of the room, an old rancher stood up, his knuckles white where he gripped his hat. He spoke of how Mercer's bank had denied him a small loan for seed, only to turn around and offer to buy his land for pennies on the dollar. Another man stood, a blacksmith, and told of how the railroad had refused to pay him for a month's worth of work, driving him to the brink of ruin. One by one, the people of Sagebrush Bend, their fear finally eclipsed by their anger, began to speak. The dam of silence had broken. Mercer's lawyer, seeing the tide turning, decided to strike. He rose, his voice dripping with condescension. He claimed this was all a fabrication, a desperate fantasy concocted by a failed rancher, and his key witness, he sneered, was a woman of questionable character. He produced a small photograph and held it up for the judge and the town to see. It was a grainy image of Eva, her hair slightly undone, standing near a piano. It had been taken at the Golden Finch. A collective gasp went through the room. The whispers started, ugly and immediate. Jack surged to his feet, his face a mask of protective fury. But Eva placed a calm hand on his arm. She shook her head. This was her battle to fight. She rose and walked to the front of the room, her back straight, her head held high. She did not look at Mercer or his lawyer. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, at the men and women who were so ready to believe the worst of her. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent room, clear and steady as a church bell on a Sunday morning. She told them that, yes, the photograph was of her, and it had been taken at the Golden Finch in Kansas. Then she told them the rest of the story. She spoke of the young girl, of the owner's cruelty, and of the choice she had made to intervene. She did not embellish or ask for pity. She simply stated the facts of her past, claiming them as her own. When she was finished, she turned her gaze to Judge Callahan. Her voice rose, filled now with a quiet, righteous anger. My past is not on trial here. The truth is, you have been shown a lie on paper, A forged seal meant to steal your homes. You are now being shown a picture. Another lie meant to steal my voice. She picked up her own drawing of the flawed lead seal from the evidence table and held it up. If the truth of what I have said is hard for you gentlemen to swallow, then swallow it with the filth of this seal. Her words struck the room like a physical blow. The shame on the faces of the townspeople was palpable. They had been so willing to be swayed by a shadow, while the real crime was being committed in plain sight. The moment was broken by Ruthie, the postmistress, who stood up and presented her railroad envelopes. The ink a perfect match, the lack of a proper postmark, a clear sign of fraud. Then Thomas Red Elk stood. He spoke of the sacredness of the land, of the poison of a lie, and of the clear moral truth he saw in Eva Mayhew's eyes. It was over. Judge Callahan brought his gavel down with a crack that echoed like a rifle shot. He declared all foreclosure proceedings based on the documents from Mercer's bank to be frozen pending a full federal investigation. He issued a warrant for the arrest of Deputy Jeb Crow on charges of forgery and attempted murder. As the judge spoke, Silas Mercer rose silently from his chair. With his lawyer creating a distraction, he slipped through a side door and vanished. By the time the marshals went to look for him, he was gone. Crow, however, was not so lucky. The marshals found him nursing his broken hand in the saloon and took him into custody. As they led him away, the bell in the small church steeple began to ring, a slow, steady peal that washed over the town. It was not a call to prayer. It was the sound of a long, silent injustice finally being answered. It was the sound of a town waking up. The winter did not release its grip all at once. It retreated slowly, grudgingly, its icy fingers clinging to the shadows long after the sun had begun to reclaim the sky. But spring, when it finally came, arrived with the force of a revelation. The first sign was the sound, a low, percussive dripping that grew into a steady trickle, then a murmur, and finally a roar as the great shelves of ice along Dry Willow Creek fractured and gave way. Water, brown and churning with melted snow and rich earth, began to flow. It did not flow as it once had, during the driest months of the previous autumn, when the creek had dwindled to a series of stagnant pools. Jack had ridden to the small encampment where Thomas Red Elk and his people lived. He had gone not as a supplicant, but as a neighbor, together, using timber from the hills and the shared knowledge of men who understood the rhythms of the land. They had built a low, sturdy weir dam. It was not a grand structure, but it was enough to catch and hold the last of the season's water, creating a deep reservoir that now fed the returning creek, ensuring it would run strong and deep through the coming summer. The water that flowed past the Circle E was no longer just a gift of nature. It was a testament to a new and fragile alliance, a shared understanding that the survival of one was tied to the survival of all. That same spirit took root in Sagebrush Bend. The fear that had held the town in a state of paralysis had been broken, and in its place, something new and unfamiliar was growing. The ranchers, who had once viewed each other as competitors for scarce resources, began to meet. They gathered in the town hall, their boots dusty on the clean floor, and they talked. They talked of water rights and grazing lands, of the price of feed and the cost of shipping. With Jack Calder's quiet guidance and the town lawyer's help, they drew up a charter. They formed the Dry Willow Water and Grass Cooperative, a formal agreement to share the lifeblood of their ranches, to create a rotating system for irrigation, and to pool their resources to buy supplies in bulk, freeing themselves from the predatory grip of distant banks and railroad monopolies. The document they signed was more than a business arrangement. It was a declaration of independence. At the Circle E, the new season brought its own rhythms. The mournful lowing of hungry cattle was replaced by the high, bleating calls of newborn calves. They were everywhere, small, wobbly creatures with wet noses and impossibly long legs, a tangible promise of the ranch's future. The work doubled, then tripled. The days were long, stretching from the cold, misty dawn to the purple dusk, filled with the hard, satisfying labor of mending fences, branding calves, and turning the earth for a small kitchen garden. Through it all, Ava was a constant, steady presence. She had seamlessly woven herself into the fabric of the ranch's life. She was no longer just the cook. She managed the ledgers, her neat, precise handwriting a stark contrast to Jack's rough scrawl. She had a keen eye for numbers, a shrewd sense of what was needed and what was waste. She learned the herd, could spot a sick calf from 100 yards away, and her calm, steady hands were as adept at helping a struggling heifer deliver her first calf as they were at kneading dough. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, watching the calves frolic in the home pasture, Jack spoke. His voice was low and serious, and he did not look at her as he talked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He told her that he had been thinking about the future, about the ranch. He said that the title of cook in hand no longer fit what she did, what she was. He told her that he could not have saved the Circle E without her, and he could not run it properly without her now. He turned to look at her then, his eyes clear and direct. He offered her a full partnership, not a wage, but a share. Her name next to his on the deed. He said the ranch needed her mind as much as her hands. He envisioned a new role for them. She would manage the books, the kitchen, and the raising of the calves. But he also proposed something more. He had seen the way the younger women in town looked at her, with a mixture of awe and respect. He suggested they clean out the old, disused bunkhouse and turn it into a place where she could teach. She could show the daughters of the ranchers and townspeople what she knew, not just how to cook and keep a house, but how to read a ledger, how to set a splint, how to handle a firearm, how to birth a calf. She could give them the skills to be self-reliant, to be partners in their own lives, not just dependents. Ava listened, her hands still in her lap. The offer was more than she had ever allowed herself to dream of. A home, a stake in the future, a name that was not whispered in shadows, but written on a deed. Respected. It was a chance to transform the pain of her own past into a source of strength for others. When he finished, the silence between them was not empty, but full of the weight of his proposal. She did not give him a grand, emotional answer. Her reply was as simple and as profound as everything else about her. She just looked back at him, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time, and said that she thought that was a very good idea. The moment that truly sealed their new world came a few weeks later. The sun was setting, bleeding across the vast western sky in strokes of deep orange and soft violet. They were walking the fence line of the high pasture, the air cool and sweet with the scent of new grass. A gentle peace had settled over the land. The frantic work of spring was done, and the long, warm days of summer stretched before them. Jack stopped and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy object and placed it in her palm. It was his father's old pocket watch, the one he had carried for years, its face cracked and its hands frozen at the moment of some long-forgotten impact. But it was different now. The crystal was new and clear, and behind it, the delicate gold hands were moving, sweeping around the dial with a quiet, steady tick. He told her that he had sent it to a watchmaker in Cheyenne. He said he had figured it was time to get it fixed. He closed her fingers over the warm metal of the watch. "So we can count our own time," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. The words were a promise. Their time. Not a time measured by the deadlines on a foreclosure notice or the painful memories of the past, but a new time, a future they would measure and build together. Ava looked down at the watch, its steady, rhythmic heartbeat a comforting presence in her hand. Then she looked up at him. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. He gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. There, in the fading light of the prairie sunset, with the whole of their hard-won world spread out around them, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but one of quiet certainty. It was light, gentle, and as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. It was a kiss that tasted of respect and gratitude. of shared survival and the promise of a future. It was the closing of one chapter and the silent, hopeful beginning of the next. The summer that followed was a season of profound and quiet change. It arrived not with a sudden clap of thunder, but with the gentle persistence of a warm breeze that carried the scent of sweet clover and damp earth. News, like the summer rains, traveled slowly but surely across the territory. It came first as a rumor, a whisper carried by a traveling salesman, and then as a confirmed report in the Cheyenne newspaper that Ruthie the postmistress laid on the counter for all to see. Silas Mercer had been apprehended in the Utah territory, brought down not by the grand crimes he'd committed in Wyoming, but by a petty and arrogant case of land fraud involving a silver mine. His empire, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, had crumbled under the weight of its own greed. Shortly after, an official notice from the Rail Dominion Company appeared on the town bulletin board. Citing unforeseen geological challenges and a revised survey, the company announced that the new rail line would be rerouted 30 miles to the south, completely bypassing the Dry Willow Creek Valley. In its place, to serve the existing communities, a small but official depot and station would be constructed on the outskirts of Sagebrush Bend. There was no mention of forged documents or coercion. The railroad, in its immense and faceless power, simply changed course, like a great river finding a new, less troublesome channel. The townspeople understood. They had not defeated the river, but they had, against all odds, defended their banks. The new station was not a gift. It was a concession, a silent acknowledgement of their victory, and it promised a future built on legitimate trade, not on theft. The Circle E Ranch became a different sort of station. With the collapse of Mercer's phantom operations, dozens of honest laborers, men who had simply come west seeking a wage, were left stranded, their pay packets empty. The ranch, once a fortress of solitude, became a place of refuge. The old bunkhouse, scrubbed and repaired, now housed two families who were working for their keep until they could find their way to new employment. The sound of children's laughter now echoed in the corrals, a sound that at first startled Jack, and then slowly, surely, began to mend a part of him he had thought long dead. Ava's domain expanded beyond the ranch house kitchen. On market days in Sagebrush Bend, she established what the townspeople came to call the public kitchen. Using a large cast-iron cauldron set over an open fire, she would cook a massive pot of thick, savory stew, rich with vegetables from her garden and venison from the hills, for a penny a bowl, or in exchange for a bit of mending or an hour's labor. Any man, woman, or child who was hungry could eat. It was not charity, it was community. It was a simple, powerful declaration that in this small corner of the world, no one would be left to starve. The Circle E was no longer just a place on a map. It had become an idea. The true celebration of their new life came on a hot evening in late July. The sky had been a searing, cloudless blue for weeks, the earth growing dry and thirsty. Then, in the late afternoon, dark, bruised-looking clouds had gathered on the horizon. A cool wind had swept through the valley, and the first heavy, fat drops of rain had begun to fall, kicking up the dust in 1,000 tiny puffs before turning the ground dark and fragrant. It was a gift, an answer to a prayer no one had spoken aloud. The celebration was not planned. It simply happened. Someone from the general store rolled a barrel of cider out onto the street. Lanterns were lit and strung from the porch of the saloon to the post office, their warm, golden light pushing back the gathering twilight. A fiddle player, one of the railroad men who had stayed on, struck up a lively tune, and soon the entire town was gathered in the street, the damp earth cool beneath their feet. Jack and Ava stood on the edge of the crowd, watching the dancers. The whole of their world was there. The ranchers who had stood up in the courtroom, their faces now relaxed and open. Ruthie the postmistress, sharing a cup of cider with Thomas Red Elk. The young women who came to the Circle E for Eva's lessons were dancing with the young cowboys. their laughter bright and carefree. The firelight from a celebratory bonfire glinted off the damp leaves of the cottonwood trees and painted the happy faces of the crowd in flickering gold. Jack looked out at the scene, a slow, easy smile on his face. He put his arm around Ava's shoulders, pulling her close. The scent of rain and wood smoke clung to her hair. He looked down at her, his eyes full of a quiet, profound contentment. He said it looked like they had made it. Ava leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the dancers spin and laugh. A small, playful light danced in her own eyes. She told him that she thought they had. Then she turned her face up to his. She had just one piece of advice for him, she said, her voice a low, private murmur meant only for him. He raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. He asked what that might be. The next time you decide to hire help for this ranch, she said, her expression perfectly serious, though her eyes were laughing. I suggest you write the notice in big, clear letters. Be very specific. Cook wanted, maybe underline it a few times. Not hostess. It might prevent some unfortunate confusion. The sound of his laughter was not the broken, painful sound she had heard in the kitchen all those months ago. It was a deep, warm, and genuine sound of pure joy. It was the sound of a man who had been healed. He held her tighter, the shared memory no longer a source of pain or shame, but an intimate, foundational part of their story, a testament to how far they had come. They stood there together, watching the fire, its warm light reflected in their eyes, two steady flames burning brightly in a land that had once been dark. Later that night, as the celebration was winding down and people began to drift back to their homes, Ruthie approached them, holding a single letter. It had come in on the late stage, she explained, and she had thought it might be important. The envelope was addressed in a fine, elegant hand to Eva Mayhew, the Circle E Ranch, Sagebrush Bend. The return address was from a town called Redemption, 100 miles to the west, a place she had only ever seen as a name on a map. She broke the seal, her brow furrowed in curiosity. Jack read over her shoulder, his hand resting on the small of her back. The letter was from a group of women who called themselves the Redemption Women's Society. They wrote that stories traveled on the wind, and the story of the quiet cook in Sagebrush Bend, of her stand against the railroad and the public kitchen she had started, had reached them. Their own town, they explained, was struggling. They were facing their own Silas Mercer, their own quiet battle for survival. They humbly requested, if she could be spared, if she would consider it, that she might travel to Redemption. They did not ask her to fight for them. They asked if she would come and share her knowledge, to help them establish an apprenticeship program like the one she had started, to teach their daughters how to be strong, how to be self-sufficient, how to find their own voices. Ava stood for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. Her past, which she had run so far to escape, had been transformed. The story she had once feared would destroy her had become a beacon for others. She was no longer a woman without a name, without a place. She was Ava Mayhew of the Circle E, and her story was just beginning. Thank you for listening to the story. We invite you to comment where you are listening from so everyone can connect and share their thoughts. And please be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.